I also have the pleasure to call upon Prof. Dina to come and talk to us about the technologies of re-imaging. What may visual university studies bring to critical university studies in Africa? Just a little information about Prof. Dina. She is a professor of authorship, presentation and transformation of academia, Queen's University, Belfast, Northern Ireland, and a visiting professor at the chair for the critical studies of higher education transformation, Nelson Mandela University, South Africa. Informed by critical traditions, her academic scholarship and practice revolves around understanding and addressing inequality and oppression within and by the university. She is fortunate to have learned about the acts of resistance from collaborations in India, South Africa, and Northern Ireland, and is part of this network, asking questions of the idea of the African university. She also serves on the Council of the Society of Research in Higher Education and on the Scholars at Risk Ireland Committee, amongst other civil society organizations advocating for transformative change. Prof. Dina, you are welcome.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sister Justine, and everybody else. It's nice to get a chance to talk about something that I've been looking at and exploring, and to hear some of your thoughts. I'm also going to be joined afterwards by Cohen Mapaleng, who's going to be speaking about much the same material, but from a very different perspective. So I hope that it's going to be of interest to everybody here. So recently I undertook a systemized mapping of journal articles published in English since the end of the Cold War, which utilized the visual to study the university. This is the spread that you can see on the screen across 54 countries of the 206 articles I found. The darker the green, the higher the concentration of publications in that context per decade. I can later share information on the search and inclusion criteria if you're interested, but I hope that it's okay that I use the short time to go into more interesting terrain. I will just briefly note why I chose journal articles and limited that critical review to that. It's because journal articles are often the testing ground for new experimental and exploratory ideas, and something of a litmus test for the waxing and waning of what has currency in our fields of inquiry. So I'm not discounting that there are important visual studies in book form, such as of Institutional Change by Fatah and Constantius on Stellenbosch University, or Schmalman's book of Picturing Change Across Visual Cultures of all South African universities. But here I've excluded books, journalism and news media, blogs, flyers, exhibition catalogues, and artists' portfolios, where I anticipate there is a treasure trove of knowledge and documentation. Limitations also included drawing on indexed journal articles and in Englishes. So I encourage you to share additional papers you may have. All right, so I'm today focusing on these 31 articles from the continent, which you can see are published in very different journals. They include 5 African countries: Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, Senegal, and Tanzania. From them, I will ask, what may re-imaging the university bring to critical university studies in Africa? Visual university studies encompasses a spectrum of orientations that take the visual as a central part of their focus, process, or product in the study of the university. and of its citizens, including the visual as subject matter, such as public art or architecture, in addition to the images collected and produced by institutions, image manufacture, the visual as method as well, such as participatory data creation, photojournalism, and creative research practice methodologies. This will become apparent as I discuss and show some examples. But in the global data set, it included the full gamut of established disciplinary traditions, such as visual sociology, ethnography, anthropology, visual culture studies, art history, aesthetics, as well as management and psychology. And Kerwin will bring particularly that psychological lens to bring deeper readings from that angle. The papers concerned about methodology, of course, were generally more critical about the visual components, including the limitations of their approaches. To be self-critical myself, what I discuss in this presentation is broader than my own interests. My social formation as an academic has been within the early transition phase of South Africa out of legalized apartheid, and with that comes a suspicion of authority and the mainstream, including methodologies and narratives that enclose criticality and dissent. Within visual university studies, I'm interested in these 4 areas broadly. Places of memory and haunting on campus, including the physical and hidden spaces, materials, and the institutional, communal, and personal archives, as Su Ming Ku was alluding to. I'm also interested in residues of resistance and erasure of acts of academic freedom, which I'm reading through the broader challenge to move beyond the ugly, beautiful debate and to see ugliness as a way to de-idealize the imperfect acts of academic freedom and their imperfect enactors, such as us. I'm concerned with the sensory wasteland that I've experienced and sometimes contributed to in studying the university. So I'm looking more at Mignolo and Vasquez's push for decolonial aesthesis, to feel, to smell, to touch and see with historical clarity. I think that it's important for challenging the disciplinary strictures, but also the erasure of aesthetics of image manufacture that our institutions produce, as well as those produced by our nations and ourselves as academic citizens. And then as a person who has practiced and lectured in art making as research, I'm looking for how the uncertainties of creative arts memory activism and representation after historic trauma can bring to critical university studies the tensions of in-betweenness, in between truth, memory, erasure, reclamation, and the temporal. So these interests are obviously not necessarily the same as the authors of the papers I reviewed. The mapping was a way to appreciate the differences and also look at the possibilities I hadn't even imagined. Across the 206 texts, I categorized 11 purposes, organized here from more instrumentalist, positivist, realist, and pragmatic orientations to critique, and those which sought to create conditions for the more uncertain and generative. When it came to the studies in the African data set, I found 8 dominant purposes. In the main, the visual was handled in the articles as descriptive. Expression, particularly student involvement to address participation as academic citizens, was a dominant purpose when it was seen to increase voice. This dovetailed in many of the articles with criticality, where visual methods were used to resist, protest, or engage in advocacy, but also critique existing visual cultures of institutions. Where that was the case, there was also an interest in commemoration, particularly in public monuments. Less prevalent, but still powerful, in many cases, was a sense of remembrance and reclamation. Care and reflection were often with those interested in community building and acknowledgement of personal and historic traumas, where reflection more often involved the authors who were academic staff. Very, very few projects approached the visual and visual research for the purposes of figurative representation itself or artistic inquiry. So to contextualize this discussion within the broader global patterns, I'll outline what emerged generally and then dive into those on our continent. The first period had 4 articles from the United States about students at the brunt of sociocultural tensions, including those positioned by racism and patriarchy, and questioning institutional belonging through the study of the wider ecology. Some really interesting studies on hostels and residence arrangements, for instance. Another study looked at Australian universities' images that they project about themselves through promotional material, raising concerns, which became a very dominant thread within these studies, about the growing instrumentality after the Cold War. Indicators of the visual material as sources of study are on the left of the screen, and the ways in which the data was generated on the right. The majority of articles in the first decade of the century revolved around students again, and then the institution. As with the decade before, there was a clear interest in problematic representation of those marginalized, and interest in the extramural and internationalization. What showed growth was the digital world as a source and an object of study, particularly in what Mayer called the virtual face of institutions, where scholars' role was to critique the image that institutions create and project at odds with its demonstrated purposes and functions. The rapid increase in the 2010 included South Africa and Egypt. The major concern continued to be about students, which on our continent included first-generation students in South Africa. In one of the earliest in this data set from our continent, 10 black students at an historically white institution in South Africa engaged in photo voice to respond to the instruction to take pictures of the barriers to your learning at the university. We can see in these images the result of the Take Pictures prompt, where the imagery is very literally about their surroundings, rather than a construction to evoke or express their feelings, experiences, or imaginings. 2 things are of interest about this article. The one is the extent of overlap in what the participants represented was minimal, suggesting that the capture of heterogeneous experience was actually enabled through this method. And then the second part was that while the paper is laced with deficit discourses, this process seemed to challenge the author's assumptions and complacency. They advocated for change in policy after seeing their students differently. Here the images were selected by the authors as examples of each major theme, which were exclusion in relation to what is valued in the formal visual culture, barriers to access, and student participants' creativity in editing when they expressed hopes for the future. The article aimed to understand students' negotiations of the discourse of black inferiority within an historically white institution. And then drawing on Photo Voice project with students at an historically black institution in South Africa, these authors strove to challenge dominant local narratives of transition to higher education of first-generation students, particularly the positioning of their inherited identities as rural students. They also wish to contribute to international scholarship, which many of you will know here originated from contexts where first-generation students are in the minority. Globally, social structures were similarly the concern of those seeing the effect of exclusion and discrimination. Race was a consideration in the minority world too, where they now use the discourse of decolonization and questioning post-coloniality. This study looked at the US university's responsibility in constructing negative portrayals of Africans. It looked at a research-intensive institution's College of Education, which sent students to South Africa and Tanzania. The images are not reproduced, you can see that, but visual analysis includes composition, placement of people, hairstyles, and body language. Onyeneko's team also point to what isn't represented, and thus perpetuates an unbalanced representation of the African continent and its people. Visual inquiry about neoliberal imaging, particularly virtual marketing and communication, grew in this decade. The only related study in the African dataset was led by Rhodes. I highlight here that in South Africa, history, place, and geopolitical relation feature in how institutions marketed themselves. In Egyptian universities, they constructed themselves in reference to their historical institutions and to Arabic language. In terms of global visual university studies, data collection included material sourced from institutional websites, social media, news and media reporting, institutions' yearbooks and archives. And while there was considerably more variation in data generation in this decade, the photograph continued to dominate, for the most part through photo elicitation and photo voice. But I'd like to look at some outliers. Secondary analysis of creative arts research included a photo essay created in 2011 by the artist Ingrid Masondo in response to commemorative efforts of the University of the Western Cape, which Van Beek and Donda interprets as about the impossibilities of South African institutions commemorating themselves. An interesting thought, as Makerere has just been through this process themselves. Note on the right how much space is dedicated to discussing the actual imagery, not only through description, but also interpretation, which is in sharp contrast to much of the positioning of the visual within such articles. The value of metaphoric and poetic constructions within words, narratives, and images by participants studying transformation in universities is the subject of this paper that I led. Here you can see the images we produced came from a number of our studies, including visualizations of published texts. Similarly, reflection on alternative approaches was the point of this experimentation by 5 academics of higher education studies. They tested out and reflected on the validity of drawings to facilitate place-based biographic research in Southern Africa, specifically Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and South Africa. Can you see how mobility is visualized as a major theme in the process of the drawing? You might remember that too from the train image of the 2011 paper in one of the earlier slides. Such methodologies are ripe for the study of mobility and immobility and migration, which is a sub-theme of higher education studies. Those 3 articles that I just showed are in sharp contrast to this, the very earliest visual university studies paper I found by an Africa-based author, where the visuals are literal representations of what the participants, in this case academics, see around them. There is little evoked, expressed, challenged, or constructed in such imaging. And indeed, the narratives above the images are also not that revealing. So now we move to the 2020s, where there has been a boom in visual university studies, with the study of the dark sides of higher education continuing and gender justice a major impetus across the globe. Orth, for instance, led an analysis of digital discourses of rape culture online through naturalistic observations of 590 selected comments on public posts and articles on Facebook related to the 2016 End Rape Culture protests in South Africa. But in the main, there have been very few studies of online cultures of participation in the African studies. Another example of the dark sides were the continued barriers to access experienced within ableist institutions in Zimbabwean universities. Note how the imagery here stands as documentary evidence of such barriers. This paper and the next were authored by a participant at this conference, Thierry. So do chat to him if you're interested. It'll have to be online because he's not here physically. The images reproduced in this article mainly perform the function of documenting for readers the process that participants engaged with, their image finding, the workshops to train them, and then the outcome, an exhibition. A book was produced and exhibitions toured the country, including a showing at the 2022 ACUSAfrica Conference, which gives some insights into why, as academics, we choose certain modes of representation. The purpose of the article is a methodological contribution in a study with multiple goals, which included the psychosocial value for the participants, the political value of participation, and the witnessing value of image making. The authors also give a glimpse as to why this method may be more prevalent in South Africa, with its history from public health to community psychology to student participation. This article then comes a little bit later, using the same methodology of rapid photo voice, where Fajidi writes, "We chose this methodology because of its ability to demonstrate social problems in a pervasive but also non-threatening manner." An interesting claim is made above the image that you can see here from a student participant who argues that the interventionist policies of art making have value in comparison to direct protest. So, the dominant trend on our continent continues to be critical in orientation, reading against the facade with a concern for social justice. However, I did notice a tension that grew globally across this decade, where different interest groups were being served by visual university studies, often utilizing, such as for the increased efficiency of marketization, often utilizing quantitative methods, data mining, and cross-country comparative analyses. Of interest was also the notable shift in this decade about complicating agency. This included the agency of research participants who are now much more clued up about image making thanks to social media, but also agency more widely in resisting and playing with dominant narratives and discourses. An example is this contemporary website, which was created from family photographs, demonstrating the agency of members of the public to contribute insights lost from public history. This digital visual activism is by the cousin of Ahmed Timor, killed by the South African security police in October 1971. It raises the question, how are we archiving the history of apartheid's universities and its resistance? As you can see on the left, Timor attended the Johannesburg Training Institute for Indian Teachers, which was the only institution of higher education for Indians in the then Transvaal. And then later, he played a leading role, becoming the vice chairman of the Student Representative Council. Here, I visually contrasted the body of that activist in the open coffin with a dismantled ex-president who supported that regime. This is my composition. But I think it's poignant, considering that both of the images are atypical. Timor's religion, which generally does not display open caskets, challenged the state's claims about his death. And that sculpture is meant to be a monolithic monument conveying immutable power. Both images are an example of the agencies of individuals and groups, not institutions, in visualizing resistance to drive change. The contrast between the sculptural objects, the differences in relation to the human engagement with them and the natural habitat. On the one side, rotten water, decay, dry grass. On the other, lush grass and growth were not taken up by the author, de Villiers Human. However, contrast and comparison are valuable visual analytic approaches. The author's concern was with formal visual culture, and she argued that the historical awareness of the power of images may aid the reconsideration of colonialism's symbolic exclusions, rather than perpetuate its symbolic violence. Image placement, language, iconic structures, and movement are all considered in this analysis of the campus graphic novel titled Sidi by Sidina Issa Sow. 3 images are produced in the article. This one depicts the university, another, travel to it, and another, engagements with a university cleaner. The story is about a young adult's university campus experience within the 2010 protests in Dakar, Senegal, where the artist challenges negative portrayals of protest by suggesting its generative possibilities under certain conditions. So I'll end with a brief synopsis of the features of visual university studies in Africa. Firstly, much research has been conducted in the aftermath of history and of crisis. Crisis, of course, raises the prospect, as Janssen and others have argued, of seeing institutional and agential responses as they emerge, rather than those controlled and manufactured. Yet, there were very few studies that reached into such histories, such as the Cold War on our continent, the independence and development periods, with very little archival work, and commemoration being mainly about the formal institutional architecture of our institutions, rather than that coming from the bottom as community or counter archives. Transitions over a longer time are not that prevalent in the African Visual University Studies set, but an example from the global set I'd like to share, this one, 156 emblems of Chinese institutions were analyzed for their oscillation towards and against Western attractiveness for institutional image making. And then there's also this one, where observations of graffiti, barricade, detritus were photographed after police intervention in Hong Kong student protests in 2019, where the photograph is used intentionally to witness and document what will be erased from institutional memory. So while visual university studies on the African continent may not be concerned yet with visualizing change, the articles do engage with the experiences of legacies of the past in the present, and with challenging institutional commemoration. The studies were mainly undertaken by those within universities, and as such, many don't cross institutional and national boundaries or engage in continental studies. For the most part, visual university studies on the continent showed an interest in social transition in the present in these three areas: social-cultural conflict, participatory standpoints, which were mainly those of students, and usually towards action within universities, and then also community bridging and building, and with that a sense of healing. In contrast to the larger data set, what is not showing, and this might be interesting for those who might want to explore this area, or at least not showing yet, or maybe showing in books, is firstly the plurality of disciplines, and then also that while the studies did engage with sociocultural conflicts, I was really surprised to see so little on gender-based struggles, for instance, on violence, change, even just basic changes in the representation were for the most part underexplored. If you think of the very visual nature of women protesting, such as the naked protests, which have happened here in this country, as well as in South Africa, the uses and abuses and violence against women on campuses, the aesthetic labor of being woman and women in position of powers, and the cultural tensions and oppressions of gender identity and marginality, including those LGBTQ, those who are exploring transgenderism on campus, that play out on our campuses and in our law courts on the continent. One of the few exceptions I'd like to share is the interesting work of Moletsane. On the right, there's a community building project between Black women academics across South African universities, where they used animal imagery metaphorically, and then also a participatory project with student teachers at UKZN. Moletsane came to participatory image making to address what she calls the methodological and ethical challenges of other methods of data generation when working with victims of gender-based violence. And while there were studies interested in rurality and challenges to decolonize, there wasn't much actually about indigenous belief systems, groups, or even relations beyond the human. An example of this from the data set, the global data set, was where Metcalfe looked at the continuation of colonial institutional violence, firstly with an archival image from 1914 within her Canadian institutional archive, and then she contrasts that with longitudinal series of images that she took during her habitual walking methodologies. In the African data set, there was a challenge of deficit discourses without a doubt, but there were very few challenges to representation and stereotyping than what one might imagine. If you compare this to a US study, where the past was drawn on to contrast and counter claims that were being made in the present, a genealogical study was undertaken searching for the roots of racism within universities by looking at their yearbooks. So there's room to consider how visual university studies may be interesting for such purposes, but also interesting to study internationalization, since we've had so much conversations in the last 2 days about globalization, international partnerships, etc. Also to study the online and the digital, another thing that came up again during these last 2 days. But then also documentation of the creative arts events or studies or interventions that we know happen on our campuses. And of course, of popular culture. We were talking about movies last night and their effects, right? And I'd like to just quickly share. On the left is the only one that looked at popular culture from the African data set. It was documentary film method, which was about a project about the Kenyan university's responses to election-based violence in 2018. Of interest on the top right is a study exploring abled academic identity in the popular cultural imagination of the United States. And on the bottom is the study of constructions of education, academic citizens, and censorship in the perestroika period of the USSR. There were very few studies, longitudinal studies at all in the African Visual University study set. But hopefully, with digital humanities, we'll start demanding access to archives and creating open access archives of our own work. While visual university studies in the continent has sought to enable voice, there is no doubt about that, and standpoints of academic citizens, there's been very little in terms of participation with people, places, and spaces affected in, around, and by universities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that insightful presentation. And what I can say about this is your expertise in visual studies and the critical pedagogy and the African context has sparked a lot of discussions within our minds, and we appreciate the time that you invested in preparing this. We are behind schedule, but I'll beg you for just a few minutes, because the next presenter is going to add on what Prof. Dina has presented, and he happens to be online. Jenny, is he there? Maybe a little information about him. Okay, he is called Dr. Colwyn Mapeling, and he is a senior lecturer and clinical psychologist at the University of Johannesburg, where he integrates psychological principles into higher education and beyond to promote well-being in the global south. He holds a Master of Arts in Clinical Psychology and Community Counseling from Stellenbosch University and a PhD in Education from Nelson Mandela University. Dr. Cohen, you're welcome.
Good morning. Good morning. I hope. Okay. Is it an echo? An echo? Okay. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks. So it seems like. Okay, it's gone away now. That's better. Okay. So I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Prof. Dina, again for the opportunity to work with you on this. I will just try and go through some of the themes so that we hopefully make up some of the time. And I think I'll just switch off my video in case my bandwidth gives me issues. It's not ideal for this kind of presentation. I'll go ahead and share my slides. Here we go. I hope everyone can see the slides. So as Prof. Dina alluded to, I'll be speaking about how we can visualize the psyche of African academia and reconceptualize critical university studies through global psychological lenses. So just an overview, we look at these are some of the themes that came up when I looked at the 206 articles, as Prof. Dina alluded to, between 1992 and 2023. So these are the 5 themes that I'm hoping to unpack in this presentation, looking at how these psychological dimensions have been operationalized using visual approaches to represent and understand the experiences of university communities across diverse contexts. To some of the key discussion points, we're hoping to get to a deeper understanding of the intersection between visual representation and psychological well-being in higher education. And through this presentation, I'm hoping that it will encourage some critical reflection on how these insights can be leveraged in the pursuit of an Afrocentric university model, in line with the theme of the conference. Okay. So the cerebral Trojan horse, Merlin Donald's work in 2001, the concept of the cerebral Trojan horse, highlights how modern symbolic technologies, such as writing, digital media, have subtly reshaped human cognition by embedding them in our thinking and memory processes. So this idea, I think, is particularly relevant at the intersection of psychology and visual studies, where visual technologies, on the one hand, such as social media, photography, and digital imagery, act as cognitive extensions, if we think about it in that way. So these external systems alter how we perceive, remember, and form identity, often without us realizing the depth of their influence. So in psychology, on the other hand, this is seen in the increasing reliance on external memory aids and the shaping of identity through visual representation online, while in visual studies, it reflects how visual media shape perception, memory, and decision-making. Just, some for 3 areas as examples. And then the work of Donald further, if we think about their metaphor here, it helps capture how these technologies subtly infiltrate our cognition and can change our cognitive structures while making us more dependent on external symbolic systems. So the politics surrounding some of these symbolic technologies reveal deeper power dynamics, as access to and control over these tools often dictate who controls public narratives and visibility. And in society, these technologies can both reinforce existing power structures by perpetuating dominant ideologies through visual media, or they can be harnessed by marginalized groups to challenge these narratives and thus assert their identities in public spaces, as we learn from the work of Donald. So I think I've spoken a bit about the intersections. I might skip this just for time and take us straight into the themes. So just to restate them, they were on a previous slide, but the 5 themes that I'm going to look at are identity and self-representation, memory and meaning-making, perception and decision-making, mental health and well-being, and lastly, social identity and belonging. Okay. So firstly, if we start off with identity and self-representation. So these are crucial for marginalized groups in academic environments where visual representations of culture, identity, and experience play a significant role in how individuals perceive their belonging, their cultural citizenship, and their vulnerability. So these themes become especially important for African and Black students navigating predominantly white institutions, where the visibility of their identities through visual methods can affirm or challenge their sense of inclusion. Visual methodologies such as photo voice, as we've heard quite a bit about, I'm sorry to be missing out on that this year, and photographic elicitation allow students to represent themselves and express their experiences thus helping to negotiate their presence within these academic spaces. And there we can see some of that in the work by Cornell and Kessie and Was. So there's the Cornell and Kessie paper. You'll see, I don't know how clear this is being displayed or projected in the venue, but I hope you can get a sense of what's being drawn, what I'd like to draw your attention to rather. So visual representation plays a vital role in fostering a sense of belonging, especially for marginalized groups. So if we think about this photo voice study, provides a powerful means of self-representation. So Cornell and Kessie explored how Black psychologists at a South African university use photo voice to express their feelings of alienation and the ongoing challenges of transformation in a previously white-only institution. These visual representations help students negotiate their sense of belonging by making their identities visible in spaces that may not otherwise reflect them. So for those of you who don't know, and if this helps the context, Cornell and Kessie are or were, Cornell has since gone to the UK, academics in psychology at the University of Cape Town. So cultural citizenship and belonging as a sort of sub-theme within this broader theme of identity and self-representation. If we look at what we have over here, so this refers to how individuals feel they belong to a community based on shared cultural symbols and values, and in higher education, visual identity plays a critical role in shaping the sense of cultural citizenship. So we look at the work of Deep Sosa and Bolowe. They highlight how cultural citizenship can be transformative and resistant when marginalized students use their visual presence to challenge institutional norms, and these students resist being tokenized, as we can see there on the slide. We are not a token, by asserting their cultural identities through visual and social activism within academic spaces. But then at the same time, universities' visual identities such as logos, branding, and campus imagery communicate who is included in the institutional narrative. And here, some of the work by Alessandri and colleagues in 2007 argue that a university's visual identity can shape the public perceptions of who belongs, further influencing students' experiences of cultural citizenship. So a diverse, inclusive visual identity can reinforce a sense of belonging for all students, while a narrow, neurocentric visual identity can alienate those who may feel underrepresented, as we see in the work of Foster in 2013. Okay, so to move on to alienation and vulnerability following on that. So while visual representation can foster belonging, it can also contribute to feelings of alienation when marginalized groups are excluded or misrepresented. So the work of Matthews and Reddy Best in 2022 found that Black women on college campuses negotiated their activist identities through dress and visual representation. However, the pressure to conform to institutional norms often left them vulnerable to feelings of alienation. And similarly, if we look at the work of Robinson in 2023, they examined how transnational student activism on social media provides a counter-narrative to hegemonic diversity work in higher education. Okay. And we look at these two examples here from photo voice studies as well. Okay. So moving on to theme 2, memory and meaning making. So memory is a crucial element in shaping both our individual and collective identities, especially in contexts marked by historical trauma and ongoing transformation. And in Afrocentric contexts, memory and meaning making are central to understanding the trauma experienced by marginalized communities, as well as the ways in which knowledge is transmitted and preserved. So visual methodologies such as photo voice provide an effective means to capture these memories, thus contributing to the decolonization of knowledge and the visibility of Afrocentric pedagogies in academic spaces. Sure, a large number of us, if not all, might be familiar with the image on my left. So perhaps you're right. Yeah. Memory and trauma in Afrocentric context. So memory and trauma are deeply intertwined in Afrocentric context, where the legacies of colonialism, apartheid, and racial oppression shape both individual and collective experiences. So Cornell and Kessie, in their photo voice study of Black students at a South African university, exemplify how the memory of past injustices, such as attending a historically white institution, intersects with contemporary efforts at transformation. The visual narratives of these students document the enduring trauma of exclusion and the challenges they face in creating an inclusive academic environment. And if we look at Rogers, on the other hand, also depicted here on the slide, they explored the intersection of refugee memory and trauma in her case study on a college art gallery where refugee love stories and experiences are depicted through visual art. This art form allowed for refugees to visually represent their personal and collective traumas, thus creating a space of healing and memory preservation. Okay. So through visual representation in this instance, marginalized communities were able to reclaim their narratives, facilitate resilience and healing in the face of historical and contemporary oppression. Okay. Knowledge transformation and Afrocentric pedagogy is another sort of sub-theme here. So I'll maybe just speak to some of it, just thinking about time. So knowledge transmission in Afrocentric context is rooted in oral traditions, cultural memory, and visual representation, all of which challenge dominant Eurocentric pedagogical models. So in a 2021 study on capturing photo narratives in short study abroad programs, it has shown that visual storytelling not only documented experiences, but also transmitted cultural knowledge. So this method, while not explicitly Afrocentric, aligns with the importance of visual methodologies in Afrocentric pedagogy, where images and narratives are used to pass down knowledge across generations. You can see two examples there. Okay, so moving on to theme 3, perception and decision-making. So these are deeply influenced by cultural representation, emotional engagement, and pedagogical approaches. Visual and cultural stimuli shape how individuals interpret and respond to information, which in turn impacts their decision-making processes. So in our context of education, particularly Afrocentric and inclusive pedagogies, visual representation can play a critical role in shaping our cognitive processing, emotional responses, and also student decision-making. The first sub-theme here, we're looking at cultural representation and cognitive processing. So cultural representation is central to how students process information, and Afrocentric visual methodologies can significantly impact cognitive engagement. As we see on the slide, the work of Berman and Nietzsche in 2018 highlight how visual arts in the classroom can enliven pedagogical methods, thus creating an engaging space for students to connect with cultural content. So by incorporating these culturally relevant visuals, students' cognitive processing is enhanced as they relate more deeply to the material. There's two other examples there, but I might not cover them now just due to time. So emotional engagement and decision-making. Emotional engagement plays a critical role in how students make decisions, especially when visual and emotional stimuli align with their lived experiences. So, for example, Everett in 2017 found that visual narratives can foster emotional engagement among first-year students, thus increasing their motivation to make decisions that promote not only their well-being, but also their academic success. Similarly, another study in 2018 demonstrated that visualizing queer spaces in traditionally heterogeneous institutions provokes emotional engagement, influencing LGBTIQ plus students' perceptions of their place in academic environments, and also shaping their social and academic participation. So in line with these findings, the image from the University of Missouri, which I think we had on the previous slide, campaign, highlights white student athletes asserting identities beyond athletics. Okay. Okay. So inclusive pedagogy and decision-making. Inclusive pedagogy and multicultural arts education shape a common goal of empowering students through their cultural representation and creative expression. Here, the work of Colby in 2011, work on installation and performance art in multicultural contexts like that of Surrey, Canada, highlights how visual and performative arts can serve as powerful tools for students to express their cultural identities. This aligns with Day's 1994 and Banks' 2001 emphasis on the importance of culturally inclusive curricula in enhancing decision-making and also fostering a sense of belonging. So by reflecting the identities and experiences of diverse student populations, educators can help bridge cultural gaps, much like Stein and Campers work on the use of photo voice to address learning barriers in South African higher education. Moving on to theme 4, mental health and well-being. So these are deeply influenced by both individual and community factors, particularly in context of marginalization and social isolation. So in Afrocentric frameworks and marginalized communities, community support, empowerment, and a holistic sense of purpose are critical for mental health resilience and personal growth. The integration of mental health practices into academic and social environments can further help us overcome stigma and thus foster emotional well-being in the academy. So we have the first sort of sub-theme here. So community support is fundamental in promoting emotional well-being. Research demonstrates that collective mental health interventions rooted in community engagement provide a powerful means of reducing stigma and encouraging individuals to seek help. So if we think about the use of photo voice here as well, it can be used to explore, or rather it has been used to explore how community college students persist in their educational journeys despite challenges. The study by Latz in 2015 revealed that community support through both institutional and peer-based networks played a pivotal role in maintaining emotional resilience among students, thus highlighting the importance of mental health initiatives that are embedded within the community. Okay. So empowerment in overcoming marginalization. Empowerment plays a central role in enabling marginalized individuals to overcome mental health challenges and achieve well-being. Raksas 2023, as you can see there on the slide, explored the concept of self-care through photo voice, showing that marginalized groups often employ creative and community-based strategies to overcome challenges and to reclaim their mental health. Photo voice has further served as a tool for participants to express their emotional struggles and create a path toward empowerment, as we can see there. Okay. So just wrapping up theme 4 and then getting to theme 5, where I'll close. If we think about holistic development and sense of purpose, so if we think about this in terms of how individuals grow emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, and this can create a strong sense of purpose, which is crucial for maintaining long-term mental well-being. So Nyawe in 2015 emphasizes that African psychology advocates for a holistic approach to mental health, where individuals are seen as interconnected with their community and environment. This Afrocentric paradigm integrates traditional knowledge systems into clinical treatment, which further helps individuals achieve a sense of purpose and holistic well-being. Lastly, social identity and belonging. So these are deeply influenced by the ways in which individuals perceive themselves within the context of their educational environments. Higher education institutions often become the battleground for negotiating representation, confronting racialized experiences, and exploring intersectionality. So these dynamics can influence the sense of belonging for marginalized groups, including students of color and LGBTI students who navigate the complexities of multidimensional and intersecting identities. So some representation and inclusive environments. I'll speak to specifically one of these on the slide, Berman and Letsia again. So representation plays a key role in fostering a sense of belonging, and they demonstrate this here through the use of visual arts in the classroom, which helped enhance students' sense of inclusion by bridging culturally relevant content to life. This method of inclusive pedagogy promotes belonging by ensuring that all students see themselves represented in the curriculum. So you can see the city running for and taking a car to the university from the car. Intersectionality and multi-dimensional identities. So intersectionality examines how multiple social identities such as race, gender, sexuality, and class intersect to shape experiences of marginalization and privilege. Here, the work of Prayor in 2018 investigated the experiences of LGBTI students in traditionally heterogendered institutions, as I think I spoke to earlier already. So perhaps to make reference of another study that was done amongst Lebanese, Indian, and Anglo LGBTI students in Australian universities, where they emphasized how multidimensional identities influence both their educational experiences and their feelings of safety on campus. Okay, just lastly, before we get to brief conclusion, so to confront racialized experiences in promoting empowerment, Douglas and Hallas in 2013 addressed the inherent racism in physical education and how whiteness remains unchallenged in many academic institutions, leading to the alienation of students of color. The authors call for reckoning with white supremacy in education as a means to promote empowerment and equity for all students. In the same vein, other authors have examined how Black students navigate anti-Black campus climates in predominantly white institutions through movements like the hashtag Black at PWI. This research highlights the importance of student-led activism in confronting racism and promoting empowerment within educational settings, thus giving Black students the tools to claim their rightful place in academic spaces. Okay, I'm not going to get into the critique and the technological context, so I'll just, in conclusion, perhaps say that reimagining critical university studies in Africa through the lens of technology and Afrocentrism presents both transformative possibilities and significant challenges. So as African universities navigate the intersection of modern digital tools and the rich cultural traditions of the continent, a balanced approach is essential to ensure that technology amplifies rather than diminishes African identity and intellectual heritage. So by leveraging these digital tools like photo voice, which we've spoken quite a bit about today, to enhance self-representation and cultural expression, as is expressed by Wass and Foster and others, African universities can foster inclusive environments where students not only see their experiences reflected in academic spaces, but also contribute to the preservation of African histories and knowledge systems. There's a bit more that I wanted to say there, but I think I'll close on that note because of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Corwin, for that elaborate presentation. Your innovative use of the visual methodologies to unpack the African academic experiences has ignited essential discussions among ourselves, and we thank you for the time you put into this presentation. Thank you for illuminating the intricacies in our African academia and inspiring transformative reflections. Thank you so much. My apologies for keeping you here for quite such a long time, but we are not going to go into another session as we had planned because we are behind schedule. So I beg that we break off for a health break, and then when we come back, we shall go into our rooms. We shall break into our rooms, and for the people that are going to remain here, the chairperson will be Fuza. And then for seminar room 1, it will be Dr. Pedro, and for seminar room 2, it will be Leah. So thank you so much for the time that you've been here with us. Now it is time for you to go. Okay, I beg that you give me at least 5 minutes for 1 or 2 questions for the previous presentations, for him and for Prof. Dina. At least 2 questions. The microphone? For the first presentation or the second one? The second. Dr. Corwin, please don't go. We have a question here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Namaganda. My name is Udaya. My question goes to the second presenter. Doctor, in yesterday's session, one presenter made remarks about the black pain in South Africa, which was so much touching and distressful. And then he's talking about an inclusive pedagogy which values diversity, promotes equity, and fosters a sense of belonging among all students, regardless of their background, identity, or ability. I would love to know from you, the previous presenter, how you wish to address an inclusive pedagogy in Afrocentric universities, more so in your country, where there is still racism and other forms of discrimination. I submit.
Thank you. Dr. Corwin, to you.
Hi, thank you for the question. Yeah, you're the echo. Yeah. Sure. So just to end as I think draw on my methodology and perhaps some of what Prof. Sue was saying earlier when she spoke about the repair that's needed. So I do think that, you know, at NMU, where many of us studied and perhaps still see as home, we speak about a humanizing pedagogy as perhaps one of these inclusive pedagogies. And I think if you look at the tenets, the principles, and the practices of a humanizing pedagogy, that might be one way to, by fully seeing the student for who they are, by applying mutual vulnerability, you know, from our end as educators or as lecturers, and also doing this in a way that is student-centered, we might then, along with the concepts referred to earlier by Prof. Sue, be able to more efficiently, doesn't sound like the right word, meet the student where they are, so that we aren't further perpetuating the instances of Black pain. And also, if you are able to access it, there's a chapter in a book, maybe I can find a way to share the reference, by Khosi Chikani, who wrote on Black pain after the student movements in South Africa. And I think that might also be an interesting text to engage with, given your question. Thank you.
The last question. To who?
Thank you very much. It's to both. And I think generally it's a question to all of us in this session.
Okay.
Or maybe a comment. I'm Luzuko Pogu from Mandela University. I've been making an observation around our theme, around all the presentations that have been happening.
Yes.
That we seem to be dangerously veering towards romanticizing everything African or Afro, our cultures, traditions, and so on. Whereas in the principle of critical university studies, even that which we want, Afrocentricity, we ought to put them in the judgment seat of reason. We ought to be also critical of it. There are certain practices, in as much as we are speaking about infusing African pedagogies, African traditions, cultures, but there are practices within Africa that need to be really relooked. So when we speak about Afrocentricity, we need to also be critical of certain aspects of ourselves as African. Certain things that are, I don't want to say backward, but certain things that as we progress today, we should start to relook. So I just wanted to put that to both presenters, but I looked at the whole, the presentations across all the days. There seems to be no attention of critiquing the African, in as much as we want to infuse it and decolonize, but critiquing ourselves as well, so that what we put in the curriculum and so on is also not oppressive and problematic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Any question for Prof. Dina?
Thank you to all the presenters. I'm a bit interested in the issue of visual, and I really wish to ask, especially in the current times where people are embracing forgetting, and the keynote speaker talked about liberal fatalism. So how really do we use, maybe how do we enhance the ability of people who perceive these visuals not only to look at them as sensory data, but to make mental images out of them, really? You know, it is a question that has bothered me throughout, the previous two presentations. Thank you.
Dina, can you go for that?
Thanks so much for the question. I think we are in a time where we're consumed by the ocular, right? We see images everywhere. We are so aware of them, yet we are not necessarily always seeing with a sense of clarity. My earlier reference to the work of Vasquez is that sense of historical clarity. So what you see now, you try to place in relation to a larger trajectory. And I think you're talking about almost mental schema that we need to think about and challenge. There's also aesthetics. And I think universities, it's visual, but that idea of image projection is very powerful. There's an aesthetics of prestige. And we've all been playing this game in this conference with our titles and our, we do that. We literally create images all the time that shape over some of the cracks and the issues that create a aesthetic of the Afrocentric university and an aesthetic of the... And my sense is, as scholars, as much as we are trying to engage in pedagogies and change things and trying to create research practices, we also need to be looking at all those cracks. And this, at least for me, is some of the importance, is the cracks in the visuals, the cracks in the representation, the cracks in the hopes, that create more possibilities sometimes than the beautiful solutions that we are wanted, that policymakers want us to deliver on. So I don't know if I'm answering your question entirely. I think I'm connecting the two, but I don't think there's a solution to the vision. I don't think this is the great promised land. I think it's another possible way in which we can look askew at what we think we know and challenge ourselves,
Thank you so much, Prof. And lastly?
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I have a comment for Prof. Dina in terms of her presentation of the systematic review of studies done under visual. She raised a particular point which, as academics who are using the qualitative approach and particularly visual, we tend to abuse in a nice way. Because when we are choosing to use pictures, for example, you want the particular participant to be free to use his or her own voice. Like the issue of the hair, is a particular participant having his or her natural hair or is having a weave and so on. Now it depends on the particular mental state and intended objectives of the researcher to make now a particular finding. So this is the danger that I have taken from Prof. Dina's presentation, that we may say we are using methodologies which raise the voice of the participants, but to what end? Is the researcher who is putting, in some cases, the views of the participants to answer a hidden agenda. This is where the point is. Thank you for that. So we should be so careful as researchers to say that we are using methodologies which are liberating whilst we have an hidden agenda. I'll make a simple example. If a particular African, because we are all harboring for Afrocentrism, if a person is having natural hair like myself and you are making a study on that, do we want perhaps as the end product to say, if you are having a natural hairstyle, we are much more into Afrocentrism? That's not an issue. You have a person who's having a weave or braids. So the intended objectives are very important. So such studies are very crucial because we have such good intentions for our studies and we participate, but the hidden objective is dangerous. I wanted to just highlight that caution. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ayanda. It's a very, thank you, and thanks for picking it up. I mean, I think this is where it's also helpful not just to be scholars and doing our work, but also scholars of other scholars, so that we have an opportunity. And it's not critique as accusation, because my word, all of us have made terrible mistakes and are still learning. But if one then begins to have a long period of time where you can look over texts, and this is why I was also a bit frustrated, Ayanda, because a lot of the people writing about it didn't show what they were analyzing. They didn't give us the trail to reread them and their work. But if you're able to do that, I mean, imagine, there haven't been that many about the hairstyles. Can you imagine that there haven't been that many? But if you were able to look over time and then critique and think, where was that scholar in their formation? Who were they speaking to? What were the larger mechanisms around them? We write so much against politically that it also demonstrates what we're writing against, you know. So all of these things become so fascinating to study as we learn about ourselves and correct some terrible injustices that scholars have done as well. So I have a lot of caution, for sure. I mean, I certainly think something like photo voice, which has become an industry and can be a very beautiful experience when you're participating. Also have to be so careful to claim that we are giving people voice. What authority do we have to give anybody anything when they aren't authors, and so they're not necessarily interpreting, or it's a moment in time, you know? So that methodological criticality that we just have to be very humble about. So thank you for picking up on that. And I very much hope if anybody does work in this area, that is what is taken forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Dina. This marks the end of our session. I remain Dr. Justin Namaganda, East African School of Higher Education Studies and Development. So we pray that the Lord bless us. May He bless all that we are going to partake, such that after partaking of it, may we derive strength to continue doing whatever pleases Him. We have prayed. Amen. Nice break.